Hello everyone, and a happy Independence Month for all the Ugandans watching out there. As we continue with our Independence series, today I wanted to look at a couple of laws to deal with bankruptcy. In Uganda, our first bankruptcy law essentially was the Bankruptcy Act Cup 61. Under this act here, essentially, they introduced a lot of laws to do with bankruptcy, including even the idea that a business can declare itself bankrupt. Bankrupt meaning that you are unable to pay your debts. Essentially, it provided for a way that businesses and companies and organizations could be able to settle the debts they had with their creditors in a very organized manner that would enable them to later on be able to bounce back and enter into business. And this law was very important for the sake of business continuance in the country. However, on its own, it could not operate on its own. And as such, 2 years later, in 1st January 1932, the Deeds of Arrangement Act was enacted as well. And essentially, the Deeds of Arrangement Act was an act that came in force to be able to streamline the laws as far as arrangements that are made with creditors. A deed of arrangement essentially was an agreement of the debtor to the creditor, telling them how and when their debt would be paid, essentially. That was the gravamen of the Deeds of Arrangement Act. However, in 2011, by virtue of the Insolvency Act of 2011, both of these laws here were essentially repealed and consolidated to form what we now refer to as the Insolvency Act of 2011. Essentially, the Insolvency Act of 2011 brought in, of course, a number of interesting mechanisms in the law of bankruptcy. One of the introductions that were brought in place by the Insolvency Act of 2011 was the idea of corporate rescue. Businesses in very many times find themselves in places there where they might ultimately lead up to a place where they are bankrupt. And instead of us just looking at bankruptcy law on its own, it was also important for us to look at how can we be able to rescue all these corporate bodies from reaching a place of bankruptcy. And so it introduced a number of mechanisms. One of the most popular ones that you might have heard about was government bailouts. I'm sure from time to time you've had some of your famous businessmen in Uganda asking for government to come out and help them out with some of the debts that they're having due to certain financial crises and what may you describe it as. So essentially, corporate rescue is one of the most interesting things that the Insolvency Act of 2011 brought about. And we have seen that this law here has continued evolving, that even in 2022, we've had the latest amendment to that, which is the Insolvency Amendment Act of 2022. And under this one here, we've had also other interesting inventions. One of them is that it has introduced the offense of unlawful dealing with assets by insolvency practitioners. Essentially, you will be found guilty of committing an offense if it is found that you dealt with assets in such a way that you're trying to deprive the creditors from benefiting from those assets, especially if you're an insolvency practitioner. Also, I think important to note was the introduction of or the reduction of the period from which by which a person who is declared bankrupt is precluded from involving themselves in public running of businesses. Previously, it used to be 5 years under the Insolvency Act 2011, but by virtue of this amendment, the time period has been reduced to 2 years, meaning that you may be out of business or out of running for such offices for 2 years, but after that, you should be able to bounce back, which I think generally is a good thing because it now encourages people to be more daring and taking more risks in business, that whereas, of course, might have their downfalls, but at the end of it all, if they should work, they should bring about a lot of results. I think in brief, that's what we can talk about in the laws of bankruptcy. And we thank you so much for tuning in. Should you need to know more about this and very many other things that deal with legal information, feel free to check the description in our bio. We'll be glad to help you.